Okay, so can I just check you can still hear me when I'm sharing my screen?
Perfect.
Perfect, wonderful. Okay, well, we'll start. So thank you very much, everybody, for having us here today to come to talk to you about the work that we do in our area, which involves estimating international migration flows with administrative data. My name's Melissa Randall, and my colleagues Rajni, Kim, Annabelle and Joe will be talking through some of the statistical work that they're doing to take the admin data that we have in the Office for National Statistics and to create these estimates of migration, which are important both to understand kind of migration policy in the UK, but also it's a really important component of our population estimates as well. So obviously people can't arrive and stay in the UK, and it's important that we make sure that they're counted when we try to assess how many people are here altogether. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Office for National Statistics. It's the National Statistics Institute for the UK, so we're responsible for all of the official statistics in the UK, particularly around population, economics, environment, health, and crime, I think is another one that falls to us. In the Migration Statistics Division, we're a relatively small area. There's 41 of us altogether, and I thought I'd share with you that 22 of us are women, so it's about half and half in our area. And to give you an idea of the issue that we're dealing with, we have about 100 million people or so arrive in the UK each year. So by flight, by train, you can come through the Eurotunnel or by ferry. We reckon there's about 100 million people arriving, of which we have to try to estimate how many of them are what we call long-term migrants. So they need to be in the country for 12 months or more for us to count them and add them onto our population estimate. So that's a United Nations standard definition that some of you may have come across before. And so trying to understand which of those arrivals are long-term migrants is the challenge that we're trying to face using the data that we have available to us. We generally find about 0.5% of them are, so they're relatively rare amongst the arrivals that we have. And of course, other reasons why people will come would be just for visits, just for holidays, for business, or short-term migrants as well. We do have people that come and might work for less than 12 months as well. So that's basically what we're going to be talking to you about today. The way that we deliver this, we tend to kind of split it out into different kind of elements of the migration flows. So first up today, we're going to have Annabelle talking to you a bit about how they apply this long-term international migrant definition to visa data that we have. So we have access to visa data for people who need a visa to come to the UK, and what she does with that to kind of develop that part of the estimate. Kim uses tax records. Again, we have access to tax records of people in the UK, and we can see when they may or may not have economic activity over the course of a year, and the things that she does to look at that to identify who we think are a long-term migrant. Rajni's going to talk a bit about the work she does with asylum seeker information, because quite often, some asylum seekers will come through a visa route and we'll see them there, and many of them don't, and how we make sure that we can accurately count those in our estimates. And then finally, Jo's going to finish up with some of the work she's been doing to look at short-term migrants, so those who are spending less than 12 months in the UK, because although they don't fit into that kind of standard definition, there's still a really interesting component of people who come, who we need to provide goods and services for, and who will contribute to the economy as well. So I won't talk for very much more. I will hand you first of all over to Annabelle on the information about estimating long-term international migrants from visa data.
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me. But yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit, like Melissa said, about how we apply the long-term international migrant definition to visa data. So if we go on to the next slide. So to start things off, here's the UN recommended definition of a long-term international migrant. So that is a person who moves to a country other than that of his or her usual residence for a period of at least a year, so that the country of destination effectively becomes his or her new country of usual residence. And we use this definition to estimate the movement of migrants to and from the UK from non-EU countries for our admin-based migration estimates. If we move to the next slide. So to do this, we apply the UN definition to our administrative data source. And to produce the non-EU long-term estimates, we use the Home Office borders and immigration data to do this. And this is an admin data set that combines visa and travel information to link an individual's travel movements into and out of the UK. So a long-term international immigrant refers to a person who has moved to the UK from abroad for a period of at least a year, and a long-term international emigrant refers to a person who has left the UK to go to another country for a period of at least a year. If we move to the next slide. So we use this definition and apply our method called the first arrival, last departure method to the data. And our first step is to identify which travellers meet the definition of a long-term migrant. So we filter out anybody on a long-term visit visa. And these are people who are only eligible to stay in the UK for up to 6 months per visit. But as the visas can be valid for up to 10 years, the method would incorrectly identify them as a long-term migrant, as it would appear that they would have a length of stay over 365 days. We use first arrival and last departure travel dates within a visa period as an approximation for length of stay in the UK. So for long-term immigrants, we look for those who have a length of stay of over 365 days or more. We also exclude short trips abroad over the course of an extended period of residence. And if either the first arrival or last departure travel information is missing, or the visa extends past the date of the data extract, then we will use visa start or end dates as a proxy. Visa periods are constructed by linking together any visas an individual holds in a row, and if there's a gap of more than 7 days between visas, then a new visa period is then started. We also look at any previous visa period to determine if this is a new long-term immigrant or one who has previously been in the country. And if no presence is identified in the country during the 12 months before a first travel arrival on a given visa, or the previous visa period had a length of stay of less than 12 months, then this person would be considered a new long-term immigrant. And then to measure emigration, we identify those who we previously said were long-term immigrants, and then those who have a last departure from the UK during the reference period. So we record them as a long-term emigrant if they do not return to the UK within 12 months, or if they only return for a short stay. We move to the next slide. So where we don't have data available showing evidence of 12 months in or out of the country, adjustments are applied to account for the over and underestimation of both immigration and emigration in the most recent time periods. So for those individuals whose first arrival occurred within the 12 months before the end of the data set, we don't yet have enough data to see a long-term stay of 12 months or more. So instead, we use their visa end date as a proxy for a future departure date. All individuals in this group with a visa lasting at least 12 months are therefore counted as a long-term immigrant. However, we kind of know that this assumption leads to an overestimation of long-term immigration amongst our most recent arrivals. Those are people who've arrived in the last 12 months. So we use historical data to look at individuals with visas lasting 12 months or more who actually left within 365 days of their arrival date and would have initially been misclassified as a long-term migrant. We then reduce estimates for the latest time points using this historical proportion. And now moving on to emigration, the first arrival, last departure emigration method is dependent on having a completed visa period within which to identify last departure. Anyone who has an open visa period at the end of the reference period is not counted as an emigrant, even if they left the UK over a year ago. So this assumption means that the emigration estimates will be an underestimate. We therefore have an adjustment to include individuals in the emigration estimate who have been absent for 52 weeks or more and whose exits have not been captured because of the visa period still being valid. For the final year, not enough time has passed to see if an individual has left for 52 weeks or more with no re-arrival to the UK. Therefore, to adjust for the final year, we identify individuals who have left the UK and not subsequently returned, and who have up to 3 months left on their visa after the data extract. And this basically identifies individuals who've left the UK and are near the end of their visa period and therefore unlikely to return. This method will also overestimate emigrants within the most recent leavers because we do not currently have enough data to see when an individual assumed to have made a last departure from the UK may in fact return within the next 12 months. So we include an adjustment to reduce estimates for the latest data time points to account for this. So as I've covered, we use the UN definition of an international long-term migrant, apply this to administrative data using the first arrival, last departure methodology, and adjust based on the assumptions that we over and underestimate immigration and emigration in the final reference year due to not having evidence of 12 months in or out of the country. So I think I'm now going to pass on to Kim, who's going to talk through how we can use interactions with tax records to identify migrants.
Thanks, Annabelle. Kim, are you able to come off mute? I think Kim's having some technical difficulties. What we'll do, we'll go to the next section, and then perhaps if we'll see if we can get Kim back at a later date. If I just forward us on to sorry, if we can just go, Rajni, do you want to come and we'll see if we can get Kim back?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk through how we can ensure asylum seekers are accurately counted in our estimates. So if you go to the next slide. In May 2023, we published our estimates for up to the year ending December 2022. And within that, we counted 76,000 asylum applicant arrivals and 3,000 returns. We also look at resettlement schemes. So in the year ending December 2022, we had 6,000 arrivals through resettlement schemes. And then we also kind of considered the category of irregular migration. So there is no official definition of irregular migration, and there are no kind of clear data sets on measuring irregular migration. To kind of acknowledge that within our estimates, we include those who arrive irregularly and claim asylum, which we believe that most do. So the Home Office have published some statistics. So for example, in the year ending December 2022, over 90% of small boat arrivals did apply for asylum. So we kind of have reason to believe that majority of the irregular arrivals do claim asylum. But we acknowledge that with what we don't include in our estimates is those who arrive legally and then become irregular by overstaying their visa, and those who enter irregularly and never claim asylum. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So a little bit more detail as to what's included within those numbers. So the resettlement scheme arrivals, we counted obviously 6,000. The source for that is a published data set by the Home Office, which says how many resettlement scheme arrivals there were within each quarter. So we've just directly taken that number, and we've had to apply the assumption that all resettled persons are long-term international migrants based on the declared intent to stay in the country. And that also kind of comes along with the assumption that all resettled persons are, like, the intention is to stay, so there are no returns. Within that group, we've included resettlement schemes, so the ACRS, the ARAP, which are the Afghan resettlement schemes. So that for that year, majority of the 6,000 is made up of the Afghan resettlement schemes, but it does also include the community sponsorship scheme, mandate scheme, the UK resettlement scheme, and the VCRS and VPRS listed there. So for the count of asylum applications, there is also a data source published by the Home Office that shows the number of applications each quarter. So we've applied an adjustment to that, which I'll talk about in a moment, but there is some information available there. But we also applied some assumptions for this. So firstly, we assume that all asylum seekers arrived in the UK no more than 12 months before applying. Secondly, all asylum seekers are long-term international migrants based on processing times in recent years, assumed deportation lag and declared intent to stay in the country. And thirdly, asylum returns are people who have been in the country for more than 12 months. So those were our assumptions for the last publication. So if we move on to the next slide, talk about the adjustments that we made for this. So in May, we made one adjustment to our count of asylum applications. So as a provisional method, we looked at Home Office migrant journey data, which showed us that, for example, in 2022, around 14% of asylum applicants held another form of leave within 7 days of lodging their application. So this means that this is the proportion of people who would have already been counted on our non-EU data set as they will have arrived on a visa, so they'll have been counted for their original reason for entering the country. And so we don't want to double count them in our data sets. So we remove this proportion from the overall number. Also for our outflow, we made an adjustment of under 1,000 to ensure that those who had a visa that expired in 2022 and that we know applied for asylum in 2022 were not included in our emigration counts, because we know that they didn't leave the country if they applied for asylum. We've updated these adjustments, so now we've kind of improved it to make it a bit more accurate. So rather than kind of making an adjustment using a proportion, this time we've directly linked asylum applications data to the visa data, so we can get the exact number of applicants who were already counted in our non-EU estimates, and removing that count directly from the asylum applicants. We've also linked the asylum applications data to the returns data to remove those who returned within 1 year of applying. So this means that we don't have to make the assumption that everybody who applies for asylum is long term. And then again, for our outflow, it's very similar to what we did last time, but kind of across the last few years, we've linked the asylum applications data to visa data, to ensure that we're not recording in emigration again if someone has applied for asylum before their visa ends. So that's obviously improving the accuracy of our adjustment there. So I think that's the end of my section. I'll move on. I'll pass over to Jo for the next section.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Jo.
Lovely. Do you want me to go next, Melissa, or do you want to go back to Kim?
Shall we go back to Kim, actually? Kim, can we hear you now?
Hopefully.
Excellent. Right, I can hear you. So let's go back, because then we've dealt with everything in the kind of 12 months definition before we move on to like the short-term migrants. So I think this is you, Kim. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. So today I'll be talking to you about how we use interactions with the tax records to identify migrants for both arrivals and departures. Historically, we used a survey to identify long-term international migrants. It was called the International Passenger Survey. It was a sample survey that was conducted at ports, and it was an intentions-based survey. So as people were arriving, we'd ask them how long they were intending to stay. And as people were departing, we'd ask them how long they were expecting to be out of the country. And we would base our migration estimates on information from that survey. As you've heard from Annabelle and Rajni, we're now moving away from that and using administrative data to try and define international migrants. The data I work with is on the next slide, and it's actually called the Registration and Population Interaction Database, or RAPID for short. It's a database that is made up of lots of different records from the Department of Work and Pensions, HM Revenue and Customs, and also some local authority information. It covers lots of systems, including the tax system, so the pay-as-you-earn system. It has information when people submit self-assessment for when they are self-employed. It also includes information on tax credits and other benefit information. It's based around the national insurance number, which anyone in the UK who wants to work or claim benefits or apply for a student loan has to have one of these. This data set summarises activity over a tax year. So we have multiple records of these. And what we're able to do is create a longitudinal database that covers multiple tax years, and therefore allowing us to look at patterns of interactions over years to determine whether someone is a long-term or short-term migrant. With these individual tax records, we actually create a migration data set. And we do this by identifying non-UK nationals who have registered for a national insurance number. And importantly, this information includes the date of registration into the UK, but also their date of arrival. We then create rules of residency for those within the UK. And so we have a combination of information on geographical location and the underlying activities, which makes it so that we can infer whether someone's currently resident in the UK. And so our rules on that are that someone has to have at least one piece of evidence that they're in the UK within a given tax year, but also an address registered in the UK. And once we have this data set, we're able to apply classification rules to determine our migration flows. So if we move on to the next slide, please. And this helps us to look at our classifications. So one of the things we do acknowledge is that people's lives are complex. There may be many reasons why someone doesn't register as soon as they arrive in the UK. There may be reasons that someone doesn't start employment as soon as they arrive in the UK. And therefore, we've developed a series of rules and 4 categories to identify people as migrants. And they're what you're seeing on the slide here. So our first category looks at those people who have registered and have activity in their first 2 tax years. So here we're looking for continued activity over 52 weeks to imply that they are usually resident in the UK. The second category broadens and is more flexible. So at this point, we take the point of arrival that someone arrived in the UK and add this time to the amount of activity that we see. Our third category looked at activity over 3 consecutive tax years. And our final category just looks at the time between registration and the end of a tax year, and also activity in the tax year after they have registered. We also want to calculate our outflow using the administrative data. And to understand outflow, we look at those people where activity stops. If we don't see any activity for a whole tax year, we assume that person has left the country and they become a part of our emigration estimates. Moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we do have to make some adjustments and assumptions, as Annabelle described earlier, with the Home Office border data. So whilst the coverage of RAPID is extensive due to the wide range of sources it does include, we do know that there are certain populations where the activities in the source data sets are less well covered. And this includes migrants that are under the age of 16, students, and those that are economically inactive. There is also a component of timeliness when using administrative data, because we have to see the activity to have occurred before we can define someone a long-term migrant. We have to make certain assumptions for the period in which they haven't had 12 months activity within the UK. The next slide takes you on to describe some of the components that go into our final migration estimate. And we have an example here for the EU nationals. So our adjustments are done in several parts. We have the student adjustment, where we are trying to take into account that not all students will work when they enter the UK, and therefore they may not appear on this administrative data set. And therefore we use other administrative data, which links HESA, which is the higher educational data set, and RTI data to understand the number of students that work alongside their studies, and we're therefore able to add an adjustment to our rapid estimate. We also have adjustments for our recent arrivals and recent departures. For the recent arrivals adjustment, we make an adjustment to account for those that have arrived but may not have registered in the country or for a national insurance number. And we also look at the proportion of arrivals who fall into each of those categories I previously described, and we average that so that those that haven't necessarily had 12 months activity, we can understand the proportions of those that might become long-term migrants. We also have an adjustment for the under 16s that is still based on some of the information we do receive in the IPS. And with all of that information, we are able to generate a migration estimate for EU nationals. That was a whistle-stop tour of the administrative data. So at this point, I think I'm moving on to Jo.
Thanks, Kim. I'll take us to Jo's section, and we will take lots of questions at the end if you have any. Jo.
Hello, can you hear me this morning?
I can hear you.
Hello to everybody from the south coast of England. Up to now, we've very much been concentrating on migrants in or out of the UK for 12 months or more. And as was explained earlier, we call them L10 or long-term international migrants. But today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing, looking at short-term migrants. We'll go on to the next slide. So up on the screen, you can see that we've put up a definition that we used in our most recent publication of a short-term international migrant. We're increasingly seeing more dynamic movement and mobility of populations around the globe. And temporary international mobility, which is the area that these types of statistics fit into, is recognised by the United Nations as being distinctly different to the long-term international migration, not just for its impact on the receiving and supplying countries, but also in the challenges for producing statistics to it. What I'm going to do over the next few slides is just again give you a summary of how we're using an administrative data source to try and give us some insights into short-term migration within the UK. Next slide, please. So at the ONS, Office for National Statistics, we know that there are flows of migrants that are not covered in our long-term migration estimates because their length of stay in their new country residence is for less than 12 months. Concentrating just on those coming into the UK, we know that we have international short-term migrants staying in the UK, which are resulting in temporary changes in population. And this is illustrated by the conceptual framework shown on the left-hand side of the slide. The circumstances where a mover, i.e. someone who is moving countries, might be considered as a short-term migrant are circled in green. And as you can see, these people flow into and out of the temporary resident population. And although they're not often counted, certainly not within the UK counted as part of the usually resident population or the official count, they do use local services and facilities, such as housing and healthcare, as well as contributing to the local economy, either by supplementation through the labour market or possibly through interaction with hospitality and recreational services. We currently produce statistics on long-term international migrations we've just been talking about. We also produce statistics for those people who are actually visiting, and we count the number of visits that they made in our travel and tourism publications. But we are aware that there is a gap between the two of those people who are coming into the UK for more than 1 month, but staying less than 12 months. And so the whole point of the piece of work that I've been doing is to try to fill that gap. And our new estimates will be aligned to the UN definition of international temporary mobility. And that's really important so that we can make sure that they're comparable to similar estimates being produced elsewhere around the globe. Overall, the estimates that we are working towards or developing to produce will be flexible and responsive to the changing needs of our society. Can we go on to the next slide, please? This is one of my favourite slides, I have to say, because suddenly, instead of having lots and lots of writing, we've got some pictures. So examples really of groups of migrants that fall into this definition of short-term migration are up on the slide. So these include any non-residents, people who are not a usual resident in the UK, who come into the UK and stay for 1 month, but not up, and go all the way up to, but less than 12 months. And they could come for a whole variety of different reasons. They could come to study, they could come to visit family and friends, to work or to do volunteer work, or as tourists. So for example, there's some examples up on the slide there, as you can see, but living in an area, for instance, for at least 6 or 9 months of a year, but less than a whole year, they may be seasonal workers or students on overseas placement. And this stay could be a one-off trip, or it could be a part of a series of visits. And we could count each of these trips separately, or it might be really useful to actually look at the cumulative length of time that they're in the UK for. Or another way that we're interested in short-term international migration is looking and considering the more complex patterns of migration. We know, as Kim said just now, that people's lives are complex. They don't necessarily easily fit into straightforward categories of how long they've been in the country. So one of the things that we're trying to do with the that we are considering repeat and circular patterns of migration. So for example, it might be someone who works in the UK from Monday to Friday, but returns to mainland Europe where they are a resident at the weekends. Alternatively, it might be someone who actually is usually resident abroad, such as in Spain, but returns to the UK to spend most school holidays with their grandchildren. So what we're trying to do here is to produce a method that is flexible, it's responsive, and it gives us the opportunity to provide insights into these different types of migration, which sometimes get swept under the carpet. The next slide, please. So how are we going to do this? How do we intend to improve our broad range of estimates and provide this insight? Well, as you probably guessed by now, we're going to use administrative data because that is what our presentation today is all about. And the wonderful thing about administrative data is that it has the most amazing amount of information within it. It's a wealth of information, and we use secure, lawful and ethical ways to produce our estimates using that information, but which are also related to what it is that our customers, our users or our stakeholders need. The big advantage of using the administrative data is that we're looking at evidence of actual behaviour. And we're looking at it hopefully in a timely and more detailed way than we'd ever would have been able to do just from survey data alone. At the moment, we're still at the proof of concept stage. We're still sorting out some of the details and we are continuing to develop it. But the main points of how we do it are now in place. So let's start with our data source. We are, just as Annabelle is on the non-EU long-term international migration, we are also using the UK Home Office Borders and Immigration data. And we're using record level data. And one of the great things about this is that it provides us with the opportunity to follow someone on their travel journey. The first thing we do when we get the data set after it's been through Annabelle's team is that we take out any long-term international migrants that have already been flagged. We don't want to count them twice if we can possibly help it. So we're only interested in those people who haven't already been categorised as long-term. And then each record that we have provides evidence that a journey has been taken into or out of the UK. And from that information, we then have dates. And from those dates, we can say, yep, this particular person on this particular trip was here, say, for 3 months or for 6 days or whatever we are, however long they were in the country for. The slide, for instance, has tried to illustrate this by showing that we are looking at the travel records for one person. And we've got 3 instances where they have been in the UK. So they have travelled into the UK and then out of the UK, in this instance by aeroplane. On their first visit, they were here 7 days. On the next one, 30 days. And on the final visit, they were here 141 days, or just over 4 months. And because we have an anonymised unique ID variable, we're able to group these 3 journeys together so that we know that they were taken by one person. And from that, we can then actually start to think about how can we use this data that we've been given. So we can either look at particular separate journeys or the longest time that they were here, but we can also look at the accumulative amount of time that they stayed in the country. And if you think back to the picture diagram the pictures that we had a few slides ago, we were actually looking there at whether we could work out, for instance, whether somebody was here for more than 6 months of the year. So i.e. they stayed in the country for more than 6 months, they were in the UK for the majority of the year, but we know that they're not in our official population counts. And that's really, really useful for us because it gives us an idea of some of the rises and falls in local populations. One of the things that we are able to do is we're able to decide over what period of time we're interested in. So at the top here, we've said, okay, we're looking at the travel records, but we're looking for them over a period of 12 months. So in this instance, it's 12 months that we're interested in. But the really good thing about the way that we are doing this method and pulling it together is that depending on what people want, we can categorize people in different ways. So yes, we could just look at their cumulative stay. So therefore they fit into maybe the category of being here at least 6 months, but not 9 months. We might just be interested in the fact they were here for more than 6 months, so the majority stayer. Or it might be that actually we're only really interested in what their longest trip was. And so having, if you like, pulled together all this information, we can then actually produce an output that is very responsive to what our users need. So it's got flexibility, which is what we're really enjoying using for it. And then on top of that, we can say, well, hang on a minute, what if we wanted to know over a period of, say, 24 months? Can we do that? Yes, we can. We can still look to see whether they were a short-term or a circular migrant who came back 7 times over a longer period of time. Other areas that we're also interested in looking into in the future is whether we can say where people came at a certain point in a time period, say in our spring, and stayed to the autumn. Is it possible to actually use some visa data alongside the information we've got here and perhaps identify them therefore as a seasonal worker? Can we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're deep into this research at the moment. We're looking forward to producing extra insights into migration patterns within the UK and in providing a greater depth and broader range of information on the types of people who come into our country, stay for a short time and then leave. We have spent quite a lot of this year collecting feedback from our users to find out exactly what sort of or types of short-time migrants they're interested in. And our research continues as we look at some of the challenges or addressing some of the challenges that we have found. One of the challenges very much highlights one of the disadvantages of using administrative data, which is that sometimes the data that you actually require is incomplete, or for whatever reason, the coverage perhaps isn't quite as good as you'd like it to be. One of the ways we can look or get a feeling if the quality of the data, even if we are concerned about these, is by looking at coherence with other data sources. And that's another piece of research that we've been doing. I think we've probably just about got to the end, so I'm going to hand back to Melissa to finish off our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo, and thank you very much, Rajni, Kim and Annabelle as well for walking us through that. I think we'll stop right there. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and we're very happy to take any questions that you have. Stop sharing my screen. Are there any questions in the chat? I can't see anything. No. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, we're quite happy to leave it there. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.